Robert Frost was there. Medical school at McGill. Was a physician for many long years, and he's telling us about his 2 years in Korea. David Newcombe.
Thanks very much, Bill, and good afternoon. I wanted to start really to summarize some things that perhaps you didn't know or perhaps you do know about my service and others who served in Korea as physicians. I'd finished an internship at Boston City Hospital when Boston City Hospital was Boston City Hospital. 3 medical services, Harvard, BU, and Tufts, and many, many illustrious physicians. In 1957, the doctor's draft was still aboard, and we figured that before we specialized or took any additional training, we'd get drafted, so why not enlist? So that's what we did. And we enlisted in 1957, and of course, as you'll recognize, my tour was in Korea, 16 months at that time, with no dependents and really no way of communicating, except in those days we exchanged tapes with parents at home. Now, I wanted to make a few introductory statements because I'm going to tell you today about how and what young physicians faced in Korea. But I want you to know some other things which I'll talk a lot more about in the second talk, and that is that I had the privilege of serving with an illustrious 3-star general, Trapnell, and I examined a number of prisoners taken by CIA agents. And I do want to state today that the agents that I served with did save lives. They captured many insurgents during my tour, and they kept the military personnel and equipment safe. There's another little axiom that I draw from my service, and that is the State Department always interfered with the military. Where I was housed in Camp Red Cloud was in a small building which was outside the general's mess and outside his helicopter pad. So we had a chance to see all these wonderful congressional delegations that were sent to Korea for 20 minutes with the general. So I never really had, and still don't have, much respect for these people who tour around the country as congressional people at our expense and spend 15 or 20 minutes with a general, and then they're off again in a helicopter. As I told you, I examined many prisoners, and I'm here to tell you they were not Mirandized, which I think is a bit of a travesty, but nonetheless. And these prisoners were often heavily armed. I remember seeing guys with 50 caliber machine gun bands around their neck. And I really don't know what happened to all the prisoners I examined. Trapnell was adamant that he wanted them examined, a history and a physical examination recorded, in part, I suppose, to show that nobody was torturing them, but in part as a part of their record. But it was only on a need-to-know basis, so whatever happened to those prisoners, I don't know. I do know the Koreans examined them secondly, and I wouldn't be surprised what happened. I was there during the RIF, which is the reduction in force. So everybody except the regular Army people were at risk for being dumped from the military, and that caused some morale problems. The helicopter was one of the key modes of transportation in Korea at that time. In fact, if you read a wonderful, what I think is a wonderful new book called The Darkest Summer, it's about the Pusan perimeter and how the army almost got pushed back to Japan. But it tells about General Craig, who was a Marine general, who used helicopters to see what the troops were doing on the front lines to move from place to place quickly. And that continued to the day in which I served. It was a wonderful instrument for removing wounded and others quickly and efficiently, and in making decisions as a physician while I'm in the air as to where we were going. And perhaps lastly, Korea was the first war in which physicians were armed. And I carried a .45 all the time I was there, and I assume physicians still wear armaments in today's Iraq and Iran, not Iran, but Afghanistan. Military service was a tradition in my family, and if I could have the first slide. Well, it's going to come. This is my parents' generation. My dad was at Fort Devens in World War I during the flu epidemic. His brother, because they were experts in the woolen industry, was actually given a commission, sent to New York in a sedan to buy all the material making the uniforms for the military. The famous name, it's the older brother of Francis Ouimet, who was in World War I. He's an uncle. This is another uncle who was in the Navy during World War I. On the next slide, these are some of the people who in the family who served in World War II. John was a pilot, actually had his pilot's license at age 16 and flew for the Naval Land Transport Command. He originally flew for Northeast Airlines, a now defunct airlines, but you might be interested to know he was stationed with Clark Gable in Presque Isle, Maine, ferrying unarmed bombers to England until the next door neighbor's son was killed at the Battle of Midway, and then everybody got drafted and he went into the Naval Air Trans. Jimmy is about a year or two older than I was. He was shot down on a raid of B-24 bombers that was going to bomb the rail lines at Augsburg. That whole aircraft was disintegrated, and they never were able to distinguish who was who, so they're buried in St. Louis. But the interesting fact is the tail gunner's brother was an artist, and I have in the front here, for those of you interested in the story of that raid and what happened to those pilots. Freddie Adams was an older cousin. He joined the Marine Corps on the advice of his father in the 1930s. His father said, "You know, Freddie, after high school, 3 square meals and a check at the end of the month ain't such a bad deal." So he joined the Marine Corps, and he was with Chester Puller in the 1st Marine Division, Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, and then surprisingly, when Puller said, "Don't give me any green troops, I want seasoned Marines," they all went back, and he went to Korea with the 1st Marine Division and made the landing at Incheon. Of course, I'm going to tell you about my service, and my brother was a stateside soldier. He was here in Providence, Rhode Island, or outside Rhode Island for his whole military service. Next slide. On the way to Fort Sam Houston, I went with another colleague who was an intern with me, and we were going through Louisiana on our way to Texas when I got hit, rear-ended by an automobile, and as I looked through the rear view mirror of my sedan, I saw the driver get out, run around the rear, and a military sergeant get out and run around into the driver's seat. So I thought that was kind of funny, but when we get out, the sergeant who was then claiming to be the driver of the car, when he really wasn't, the civilian was driving. We could smell alcohol. It wasn't a big, thoughtful decision that we had to make. They'd been drinking, and the sergeant was a bit arrogant. And what he said to us, "Are you guys in the military?" We said, "Yes." He said, "Where are your orders?" Well, of course, our orders were in the trunk, and we never gave thought as to what right he had to see our orders. But once we rummaged through the back of the trunk and got our orders, of course, we were commissioned first lieutenants. The language changed dramatically. Everything was yes, sir, no, sir, after that. And we journeyed on to Fort Sam Houston, which is where all physicians go to get their original training. And when we got there, would you believe it or not, the person who was responsible for housing people at Fort Sam Houston didn't realize that 300 physicians were coming there. So all they had was World War I barracks for us. So we decided to stay on the town in a motel during our tour of 3 weeks of duty. We then, at the end of that 3 weeks, we got our orders for overseas assignments and elsewhere. Next slide, please. That's the front gate to Fort Sam Houston, and if you go through there, it opens up into a huge quadrangle where we met every morning for news and what we were going to do that day. We saw all the weapons fired that the U.S. Army had at that time, and we actually underwent machine gun fire at night in a course that they had so that we'd be used to weapon firing if we happened to face it later on. Next slide. Fort Sam Houston is an interesting place. It was established in 1845, and it originally was 40 acres. It's now over 3,000 acres. It's a huge facility. Next slide. It has housed a number of famous people, Geronimo and other Apaches in 1886. Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders were there in 1898. He drilled them for the Cuban campaign and the Spanish-American War. Blackjack Pershing of World War I fame was there during his Pancho Villa campaign, and even Dwight Eisenhower had an assignment there. Next. It is the headquarters of the 5th Army, and it has, of course, the Brooke Army Medical Center, and a number of other commands are stationed there. It's most famous for its trauma center and its burn center, which are probably one of the foremost burn investigation units in the country. Next. It has also a Defense Medical Readiness Training Institute, an Army Medical Department, and an NCO Academy, and there are over 27,000 civilians who work there. I got my orders for Korea, and an interesting experience transpired, which I won't say much about, but there were a lot of physicians who were not very happy with their assignments. Some of them got assigned to Anahuac, and one physician who I remember went to see the staff and tell them that he belonged to a communist organization in high school. He wanted to get his orders changed. Well, needless to say, he didn't get his orders changed, and he went to Anahuac for 12 months. Incidentally, I forgot to tell you, but for those of you who've never seen a medal citation, Freddie Adams was the recipient of a Navy Cross for action on Cape Gloucester. And you might be interested, up in the front I have the citation they got for the Navy Cross. My orders were to get to the Oakland Army Base and from there to be shipped to California, to Korea. There were few stateside posts. Most positions went to either Germany, France, or the Far East. And the only interesting thing that occurred when we came from Fort Sam Houston to hurriedly get home, get things in order, and get off, was that was the time that they were integrating the schools in Arkansas, and so we had to actually circumvent Arkansas because the place was loaded with military and we couldn't get to the right routes that we wanted to. Next slide. My mother was a bit nervous about my service. I wasn't worried because I was a captain at that time and I didn't really feel that I was going to have any trouble or difficulty being a fairly senior officer. It turns out later on that I found that she'd been in correspondence and talked on the phone to Freddie Adams, another cousin who had been with the 1st Marine Division, who probably shared with her some dismal stories of his tour in Korea. But I got to the Oakland Transient Officers Base and they assigned me to a bed and I took my luggage over there. But as soon as I seated on the edge of my bed, the loudspeaker went off and I had to go to the desk to find out what was going on. And I was informed, you're going by ship. Well, that's fine. He said, there'll be somebody by to pick you up and take you to the railroad station because you're not going to ship out from here, you're going to Seattle. I said, fine. Went back to my bed, and really the next few incidents were the really awakening of me as to what it really meant to be an officer. A corporal came and over the loudspeaker again wanted me to stand up so he could find out who I was. He came over to the bedside and said, come on, we're ready to go and get the train to Fort Lewis, which is where we shipped out of. And I said, fine and dandy, and I went to grab my bags, and he said to me, I'll take those, sir. So that was my first introduction. He had my train tickets. It was like a taxi cab. He took the bags, put them in the back. He opened the door for me. I sat in the back, he sat in the front, and I got driven to the railroad station. When I boarded the train that evening, I I got hungry around 6 o'clock, and I went up to the dining car, and the maitre d' said to me, "Would you mind sitting with other military?" I said, "No, not at all." So I sat down at a table with a light colonel, a major, and a warrant officer. And it turns out that we were all going to the same place. We were all on the ship going to Korea. So when I got to Fort Lewis, another incident occurred to me that told me about the camaraderie amongst military people. And that was the fact that the major recognized that I didn't have a winter coat. He said, "You know, Doc, you better get a winter coat where you go and get some gloves." And he sent me over to the PX, and I did that. But again, always looking out for somebody else. And the other thing that occurred was the evening before we left, the colonel said, "You know, we won't be getting much steak in Korea, so why don't we all go to the officers' club and have a steak dinner before we go?" Well, officers' clubs in those days, and I suspect still are, fairly inexpensive. I think we paid $2 or $1.50 for the steak dinner. And when he got to the table, he said, "I have an announcement to make." And I said, "Fine." He said, "I'm the ranking Army officer on board the Mitchell, which we're going to sail on." And he said, "I've appointed the major here as my executive officer, and you, Captain, are my physician in charge. We're going to board 3,000 troops. So you're going to take care of those 3,000 troops while we go to Korea." So indeed, we did board the USS Mitchell, and we can skip that slide. And well, that tells you that he was the ranking officer. We were bused from Fort Lewis to Seattle. We saw snow-capped Rainier. That's my last memory of the U.S. We took the Great Northern route to Japan, and up through the Aleutians it was terribly foggy. And I think the horn of that ship sung me to sleep the first night. The ship was well stocked with everything. And about 2 to 3 days out to sea, we ran into the end of a typhoon. And that was a rude awakening for me. Here was this transporter, and I'll show you a picture of it in a minute or two. The waves were just unbelievable to me, 50 to 60 foot waves. The screws of the ship came out of the water, the whole ship shook, and it taught me that there must be a force greater than man. We had a lifeboat drill before that happened. The food was phenomenal. But the lieutenant colonel didn't appear during the typhoon. Now, the Navy ship had all these wonderful things aboard, and they had an ice cream bar, so we sent him up a pistachio frap for good luck while the typhoon was with us. There's the USS Mitchell at a different port than where we were, but a good-sized ship and phenomenal accommodations. In fact, the lieutenant colonel ate with the captain of that ship, who was an ex-submariner, and he had a Filipino houseboy, and I got to get a meal or two there myself, and it was unbelievable. Everything cooked by the Filipino houseboy and brought to the captain for his consumption. I think we can skip that and go. The other thing that I remember about the sea journey home to Korea was the fact that plankton in the ocean at the evening when we came close to Japan were phosphorescent, and you could look over the prow of that ship and see in the breaking water these beautiful red phosphorescent plankton. I'm going to show you some pictures, and I think we can skip this slide. That's Mount Fuji, and that's an imposing sight as you approach Yokohama, which we did. We had some troops getting off in Japan and some troops getting off in Korea, so I had really no duties except seasick military on the way over. There was nothing terribly exciting for a physician to attend to. Next slide. This is Yokohama, and you can see Fuji in the background there. These bulwarks were where the submarine nets were set across during the war. And of course, the captain of the Mitchell remembered that quite distinctly. Here we are entering closer in Fuji on the right there. This is my really first view of Japan. Next slide. Here's the tug that came out to help us dock, and again, a closer up picture of Fuji, a busy harbor, Yokohama in those days. Now the other interesting thing that struck me about Yokohama was that when I got off the ship and get down to shore, the streets were so narrow I could almost reach my hands across to the buildings on either side of the street. I went in and got some woodblock prints, which were what I was told were the thing to get in Japan at that day. And then the colonel informed me that the captain had a Jeep on board, and lo and behold, as I looked up, out of the hold came his Jeep. And he hadn't been in Tokyo since World War II, so he wanted us all to accompany him to Tokyo. So we did. And we again had went to the officers club, had a steak dinner again, and then his driver toured us around to see the Emperor's Castle with a moat around it, the neon signs on the Ginza, and all the things that you might expect to see on that day in Tokyo. We were, I would say 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning before we headed back to the ship, because the ship was sailing that afternoon for Incheon, Korea. So we got back to the ship, and in 3 days we were in Incheon. And for those of you who have forgotten the genius, the only genius of General MacArthur, the landing at Incheon was a great controversy, but eventually MacArthur prevailed. The controversy was about the 30-foot tides. So you had to get in and get out of that place quickly, otherwise you'd be sitting on mud flats. And I couldn't believe it, but Mitchell went in, and we were probably maybe 200 or 300 yards offshore, and we were on a landing craft to go to the dock, such as it was. And then we went to Yongdong-po to get our orders for where we were going to be stationed in Korea. Of course, as luck would have it, the lieutenant colonel, the major, and the warrant officer were all assigned to Seoul. But this guy, Captain Newcombe, got his orders to go to Weijambu. Now, I had absolutely no idea where Weijambu was, so I said to the sergeant, I said, where's that? He said, oh, it's up north someplace near the 38th parallel. So I thought to myself, that's great. He said, but there'll be somebody here to pick you up and take you up there pretty soon. So along came probably the quietest corporal that I ever met in all my career. Incidentally, he did inform me that I was going to be the commander of what's called the 121st Medical Detachment. So I took all this in, but really knew nothing. The driver arrived, and I can remember clearly going through the middle of Seoul in a Jeep with his hand on the horn all the while, because there were dirt roads, no paved streets in the middle of this city, and there were myriads, it's about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, myriads of Koreans swarming all over the street. I was afraid literally we were going to hit them. But he had the horn going all the time as we moved out to the gate. When we got to the northern gate of the city and we got outside that, nothing. Pitch black, no electricity, no lights, no nothing. Well, I tried all the way up to find out where I was going and what it was going to be like, but I didn't get much information. To give you some estimates, Seoul is about 34 miles from the 38th parallel, and Weijambu is about halfway to the 38th parallel, so about 17 miles north is where I ended up. I really had absolutely no idea where I was going or what it was going to be like. Next slide. Got to the main gate, and of course the military policeman saluted, but he wanted to see my orders, which I produced for him, and he waved us into the compound, Camp Red Cloud, and I'll tell you about Red Cloud, the Indian, later on. I was assigned at that time to a 3-man Quonset hut, and it was pitch black. I never met my roommates until the next morning, and it was heated by a potbelly stove fed by wood while you were awake. Needless to say, when I got there, there was no fire going, and it was quite cold. There was a common latrine across the street. In about a month or so of living in a Quonset hut, which wasn't terribly comfortable, I was assigned to permanent housing, which they were building at the time on the base. I first lived in my permanent housing with a major, and he was always complaining about a colonel who eventually got his star when we were there, Elegar. This colonel was an expert in atomic weaponry, and the rumors that I still think exist, and probably are true, that we had atomic artillery in Korea. And I don't know that for sure, but my strong suspicions that that's why the North Koreans were quite upset. In about a month, I got assigned a permanent roommate. He was a great guy, Dave Thomas. He was a captain. He was in the 101st Airborne Division, and he was assigned to G4, and he took care of all the transportation. So he knew all the motor pool people. He knew all the helicopter pilots. He knew any place I wanted to go, Dave Thomas could get me there. Now I want to tell you about Red Cloud. Red Cloud is a camp named for Corporal Michael Mitchell Red Cloud, Jr. He was in Company 19th Infantry Regiment, 24th Infantry Division. He was a member of the Winnebago tribe from Wisconsin. He joined the U.S. Marine Corps at age 16, and he was a machine gunner in Carlson's Raiders on Guadalcanal. And he was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for action against the Chinese Communist forces on November 5th, 1950 in Korea. And there's a picture of him when he was a Marine. Next slide, I think. I just wanted to read you, for those of you who've never seen a Medal of Honor citation or heard one, Corporal Red Cloud, Company E, distinguished himself by conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in action against the enemy. From his position on the point of a ridge immediately in front of the company command post, he was the first to detect the approach of the Chinese Communist forces and give the alarm as the enemy charged from a brush-covered area less than 100 feet from him. Springing up, he delivered devastating point-blank automatic rifle fire into the advancing enemy. His accurate and intense fire checked this assault and gained time for the company to consolidate its defense. With utter fearlessness, he maintained his firing position until severely wounded by enemy fire. Refusing assistance, he pulled himself to his feet and, wrapping his arm around a tree, continued his deadly fire again until he was fatally wounded. This heroic act stopped the enemy from overrunning his company's position and gained time for reorganization and evacuation of the wounded. Corporal Red Cloud's dauntless courage and gallant self-sacrifice reflects the highest credit upon himself and upholds the esteemed traditions of the U.S. Army for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty in Pyongyang, Korea, 5 November 1950. So that's what Red Cloud, and that's the gate of Red Cloud at the time I was assigned there. You can see when we arrived, the military policeman was here, but you can see him up here directing traffic. Again, dirt roads. Look at the mountains behind, because they're a theme that you will see again and again. That's what we fought over. Terrible battles. Next slide. What did Camp Red Cloud have? Well, it had the headquarters at First Corps. General Trapnell, a West Point graduate, was commander when I was there. Had the 121st Medical Detachment, which I ran, had G1, G2, G3, and G4. The general that I was assigned with commanded both divisions on line, 7th Infantry and the 1st Cav. We had the CIA intelligence chief there who did wear rank. He was a light colonel. The rest of the CIA agents, nobody wore rank. General's mess, an officer's mess, an enlisted mess, an officer's club, an NCO club, an enlisted club. And all those clubs really had was alcohol. They could make hamburgers or something like that, and slot machines. That's about all that they contained, not much else. We had some surrounding companies, and they're interesting because they had a lot to do with the 55th Military Police Unit commanded by Captain Ivory. The 51st Signal Battalion, they were in trouble all the time because they were out on their own. The 43rd MASH unit was above me, and I knew all the physicians there because many of them were trained. In fact, the chief surgeon there was a Bellevue trained guy, and he and I had good camaraderie because Bellevue would be similar to Boston City. Engineering Battalion, a helicopter company, which I had a lot to do with, a motor pool, and surprisingly, the 7th Turkish Brigade was above us. Next. When there was hoopla on the 38th parallel, Red Cloud was always evacuated. And you'll see why in a while, because we were on flat ground and they wanted to get us to higher ground. And they always occurred in the middle of the night. And it usually took us about less than an hour, maybe a half hour, to clean the camp out and get to high ground where we would have an advantage, because we're sitting in a valley between mountain ranges, and of course if the north decided to come down, we'd be sitting ducks off, not on the high ground. So we were in the high ground when we evacuated. There's my unit, not a very fancy unit. You can see the background of the unit there. And that's what I ran for 16 months or more. My responsibilities were to maintain ethical and moral responsibilities as physicians you'd like to have. We had to have high standards of medical care, and we had to integrate that with the military hierarchy, and this becomes important, as you see, when I had some difficulties. The RIF, and does anybody know what WPPA stands for? No. West Point Protective Association. When I'd been there just a month or two, there were rumors about a physician that ran the facility in Seoul. Could never prove it because we didn't get down to Seoul too often. But he was transferred to my unit. Of course, he outranked me, so he became the commanding officer of the unit. Well, 2 episodes occurred that, 3 episodes that solved that problem. One was, one night I got a call from the telephone operator on the base, and he said, "Captain, I'm sorry to wake you, but the major is trying to get a hold of the general, and he sounds a little drunk." I said, "Well, let me get up and see what I can do." So I got down, and he'd finished about the half of a fifth of Scotch whiskey, and he was indeed drunk. And I sat and told him that if he didn't, if he got a hold of the 3-star general, he put his call through, he'd be finished in the military, and he'd be out of the military rather quickly. So he promised he wouldn't, but subsequently one evening I got another call that from my unit when he was on call, and he said, "We've got a bunch of patients here, but the major's here and he's drunk." I said, "Fine, I'll get up and look at the patients," and I did, and took care of that. But then the final coup d'etat was that the 1-star general one day called me over, and I was much closer to the 3-star than the 1-star in friendliness. And he called me in, sat me down, and said, "Captain, you're commanding the medical unit. I will countersign any order you wish to give." And of course, that finished the major's career. He was no longer commander, but the 1-star did what he should have done, which was he recognized there was a problem and he corrected the problem immediately. The next episode I had with rank, and I always had fun with rank because I never was bothered by it. One time when the unit was cleared out in the field, and always there was a skeleton crew that remained behind, I got a call from a light colonel. Said, "You got to come down to the hooch. I've got a very sick officer here." I said, "Well, I can't do anything in the hooch. I got all my equipment here." He said, No. He said, "He's too sick to move. You got to come down here." I said, "Well, I got all my equipment in the detachment, no, you've got to come down. That's an order, Captain. I said, okay, fine, I'll come down. So I come down, and guess what? I got a priest in the DTs. So what do you do in this situation? Now, a delirium tremens is a hospitalizable condition. They needed to be sedated, they need to be fed, all the rest. And what the lieutenant colonel didn't want, he didn't want the general to get back and find this situation, because he figured that would be the end of the Padre career in the military. So what he did was he kept demanding that I take care of him. And I said, it's impossible for me to take care of this man. He needs to be in the hospital. No, you can't send him to Seoul. No, you can't send him to the MASH. So I finally said, look, I'm going to get my sergeant down. I had a master sergeant who was fantastic, ran the unit. And I said, before I get down, I said, look, I want you to witness all of this, because I don't think this is the proper treatment. And I just want somebody to witness what's going on. So lo and behold, down he came. Eventually I said, does he have any friends? Oh yeah, he has a friend up in Corradi. I said, look, let me go back to my unit and call the Corradi and find out who the friend is. He's a Padre, he said. So I did that. When Big Irish Bo got on the phone to me and said, surely to be, I know the fella you're talking about. Has he got a little trouble? I said, yes, he does. I said, I'll be right down. I'll take care of him. I've done this before. So down he came, and he sat with that priest for about a week and a half, fed him, and eventually got him out of the DTs. And I wiped my brow, because, this is not a good situation. But that was a lieutenant colonel who wanted me to do what he wanted me to do. And let me tell you about one other episode which is sort of interesting that occurred to me. One day I got a call from the master sergeant who ran the enlisted man's mess. He said, Captain, I want you to come up and have some coffee. I said, sure. Can I bring my master? Sure. Come on up. I get up to the enlisted man mess, and the awful odor, a stink, just terrible. Now, of course, we had rice paddies fed by human excrement, and that's what I was smelling. I said, God, what's this odor? He said, well, they made some misconnection out in the field there. And I said, there was a Lieutenant Colonel King that was head of the unit, the base. And I said, does Colonel King know about that? Oh, yeah, we talked to him 2 weeks ago. I said, gee, that's funny. And so we finished our coffee, and I went back to the thing, and I said to my master sergeant, hey, look, you can't feed guys in this kind of stench. He said, well, what do you think you'll do, Captain? I said, well, I'm going to call Colonel King. I get the major on the phone. Colonel's very busy, can't talk to you. I said, well, it's a very important issue. I want to talk to the colonel. Well, can't you tell me? I'll tell the colonel. I said, no, I want to talk to the colonel. I said, all right, let me see if I can get him. Colonel King on the phone. I said, Colonel, I just came down from the enlisted man's mess, and it's an awful odor up there. Do you know about it? Oh, yeah, they told me about it. He said, I'm going to get up there and fix it in 2 to 3 weeks. Well, that was a problem for me. I said, gee, myself, I can't let that go on for 2 to 3 weeks. So I said to the colonel, well, what I think I'll do is I'll just shift the enlisted men's mess out to the field and feed them out in the field until you can go. Oh, he said, don't do that, don't do that. Of course, if I fed them in the field, they'd be right directly in front of the 3 Stars housing. So he didn't want me to do that. Well, I said, look, he said, how can we repair that? I said, well, it's a simple, I don't know, you know how to do that sort of thing? He said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll get a crew up there right away. So I said, well, okay, and I looked out my window, and in about 15 minutes, sure enough, the crew was there to fix what was wrong. So I never had any fear of rank, because there was always a way the physician could work his way around the rank. I went to a helicopter initiation, and what they did in the helicopter would initiate men where they have a beer stein and they filled it with everything on the bar. And it was a shocker to me, because they either could drink it within an hour or they could chug-a-lug it. And people that chug-a-lug that, you could actually see their central nervous system deteriorating after that happened. Without a question of a doubt. I said, good Lord, that can't go on. So I went again, a number of meetings I had with the 3-star general. I called up Trapnell. I said, I need to see you, General. He said, fine, come on over, Doc. Went into his thing. He said, sit down, Doc. What's the trouble? I said, well, I just saw the initiation at the helicopter company, and I said, this is a dangerous situation. If these guys vomit, aspirate, they're not in good shape. So he said, what happened? I told him the story. He said, I'll take care of it. Never again did they initiate a helicopter pilot with that kind of thing. But that's the sort of thing. I had a number of ladies who wanted to come back to the U.S. with their boyfriends, and we had to examine them for communicable diseases. And in those days, open tuberculosis was rampant in South Korea. And I'll tell you, if I saw one, I probably saw 20 or 30 girls with open cavitary pulmonary tuberculosis. We had mini x-rays. We could take an x-ray and look at it. And they had cavitary lung disease, and of course they weren't permitted to immigrate. I wanted to tell you about how the interference with the State Department occurred. Generals on their efficiency report, the venereal disease rate was a big component of that. And venereal disease rate, it might interest you to know, was top secret in those days. It was not allowed to be proffered around, but we saw plenty of it. And so the general called me one day and he said, Captain, he said, I'd like very much to cut down the venereal disease rate. And in those days, the first long-acting penicillin was coming on the market. And I said, the military police know where these young ladies are. We could treat them with long-acting penicillin, be careful about any allergic reactions. We could handle those. And then you might reduce the rate of gonorrhea, which is really the major tour de force that we saw. He said, that sounds like a good idea. He said, could we get the long-acting? I said, sure, we can probably get long-acting penicillin. He said, let me talk to the 4-star ID White in Seoul. Talked to the 4-star. 4-star said, oh, that's a wonderful idea. Let me talk to the civilian representative here in Korea. Now, what do you expect the civilian representative said? Oh, absolutely not. We couldn't do that. What would the mothers of our boys think if they knew we were supporting prostitution? So that whole idea, that's the State Department's interference with the military, and we were never able to do it. Now the 1-star was an interesting guy. He was not well liked, but I had a pal up at the MASH unit by the name of Lakazi, trained at Bellevue in New York, a surgeon, and he'd always get me on the phone whenever we had some kind of thing and say, he'd always start out with the line, didn't they teach you anything at Boston City Hospital? So I said, well, what's the problem? He said, well, I got your 1-star up here, so what's wrong with him? Well, he's got you-know-what. I said, what do you mean he's got you-know-what? He said, well, he's got a little of the gonorrhea. I said, well, I didn't know that. He said, well, he's up here probably figuring he'd get better care up here than he could get from you. Now, of course, I held his medical records. Lakazi didn't have his medical records. It wouldn't go on his medical records because I couldn't put it on saying, gee, I've never seen this patient, but I know. So that's how the rank got away with things they shouldn't have gotten away with. But in any event, I got my rudest awakening when one of the, my roommate actually and another captain in the airborne wanted to take me into Seoul to get a steak. So I said, sure, we'll go along. So I went down there, and before we pulled in the officers club, there was absolute, I mean, it looked to me as a kid, I remember going in and seeing the big bands in town and the lines around the block for Benny Goodman and Gene Krupa and the rest. And there was a line of brocade, dolled out Korean women, such as I've never seen before. So I said to the guys in the Jeep, my God, what are all those women doing outside the officers club? He said, Doc, were you born yesterday? I said, no. He said, well, it's a simple rule. None of these Korean women can get inside the officers club unless they're on the arm of a military man. So that was the tale. These young ladies were waiting for somebody to take them in and treat them for some dinner or some food. And, but again, was I naive? Yes, indeed. I had one final episode that occurred to me to show you the power of a master sergeant. A master sergeant ran that unit. His name was Kilakausis. He was from Pennsylvania. He was a Pole, but he was a wonderful guy. He was only about 5'4" in height, but he ran that unit to a T. And one time we had some problems that we were losing things from the pharmacy. I had a small pharmacy that dispensed medications, and we were losing penicillin. Well, it turns out that there was another staff sergeant who'd rigged up a deal with the other non-coms on the base, and they were getting penicillin without ever seeing the physician. So off their charts again. Well, the master sergeant put his ear to the ground. He found out who was doing that, and he put an end to it fairly quickly. The staff sergeant was gone, a few other enlisted men were gone, but my penicillin supply was in. So for the next week or so, after this all gang got broken up and segregated, about a week or two after that, I got called out one night to see my master sergeant who was beaten to a pulp. And I was angry as the devil. And I said, Sergeant, I want to know who did this. I will bring him up for courts martial. Don't worry, Captain, I'll take care of it. Don't worry, Captain, I'll take care of it. So I never could get anything out of the master sergeant. But I can tell you for the next 6 weeks, one a night, that master sergeant, all 5'4" of them with a 2x4, waited for guys outside the NCO club and beat them to a pulp. So that's the key event that occurred for my master sergeant, who, one of several things that, maybe I'll tell you one other story about him. Is such a great guy. My second in command was a captain who was able, through the one staff, and able to have his wife and soul working for a religious mission. He's probably the only person that had his wife and soul, because nobody else was allowed. And one night I got a call from him, one morning I should say, telling me that the Jeep was nothing but the axle left. The Koreans had stripped his Jeep. And of course, during those days, the only taxis in Japan were all American Jeeps revamped to be taxi cabs. Well, all the equipment in the unit is signed out to the ranking officer, so that Jeep literally belonged to me. So what do? I get the master, I gee, you know, I've got nothing but an axle of my Jeep left and sold. He said, don't worry, Captain, I'll take care of it. I said, what are you going to do? He said, you just sit tight, I'll take care of it. We'll get the deuce and a half down to pick up the Jeep, and when I get it back, I'll fix it up. So down goes the deuce and a half, up comes the axle, no tires, no nothing. I said, what are you going to do? He said, don't you worry. So in about 2 or 3 weeks, he calls me over and he says, hey, you got a spare time? I said, yeah. He said, we're going to make a medical examination over the motor pool. Hop in the Jeep with me and let's be off. So what the sergeant had engineered was they took a spare part from this, a spare part from that, and they reconstructed my whole Jeep, including the red signal and the siren that I had. So he saved me from a lot of worry and concern. Next slide. What were some of the medical issues? Well, there were a lot of them. Meningitis was one. We had a meningitis episode online, and the 3-star called me in, wanted to know what we was going to do. Would we treat? Would we not? Would we this? I said, let's wait a while. We'll keep everybody on post and see if anything happens. Nothing did, so we got over that. Hookworm, common problem. Not so much in the GIs, but the rice paddies, everybody was barefoot. And a hookworm comes in through the skin and gets into the body, and they're anemic. And if you looked at a stool sample from any Korean, you'd see all kinds of hookworm eggs. Schistosomiasis, a very difficult problem, transmitted by snails, swimming in streams. It's called swimmer's itch, but it can be a chronic and fatal liver disease. I saw a few of these. I saw lots of these. I saw Korean hemorrhagic fever, which is a flu-like syndrome that it was called Manchuria fever. It is a flu-like viral illness transmitted from rats to humans. And I saw only 2 cases of that, but it was rampant during the Korean War itself. Believe it or not, malaria. And we used to have on the tables during the summer chloroquine, a medication used to prevent malaria. Now the Koreans were an interesting people, and the waiters in some of the mess halls thought that if 1 pill was good, 30 pills ought to be much better. And of course, chloroquine in that dosage would cause hypotension, low blood pressure, arrhythmias, and deaths in a fairly rapid time. So we had to get those people quickly to the hospital. This is the age group in which schizophrenia occurs, and I saw a number of young soldiers with the onset of schizophrenia, one of which I remember quite distinctly because I took him at his word that he would go by ambulance to Seoul, and of course the military police picked him up on the road, and he was out in the middle of the night saying that he'd met his maker and all kinds of psychotic ideation. But I finally got him to Seoul. And the other thing that occurred quite frequently, the Koreans were great craftsmen. They would use the copper casing of shells to generate swagger sticks, all kinds of things that they sold to the military. But unfortunately, not all the shells that they were absconding the copper from were deadheads. And I got one day a call that there'd been a Korean severely injured down in some area off base. So I got in the Jeep and went down, and the fellow was there with actually his hands hanging by a single thread of skin on either side. And now the problem was he hurt on an American base, or was he hurt off an American base? Was he hurt on American soil, so to speak, or not? Because that's who would befall the care of this guy. Well, we couldn't wait, so I said to the sergeant, go back, get some blood, and let's get him to a hospital where we can infuse him with blood and get him out of his shock, which we did, and we got pulse back, and by that time he was in a small Korean hospital downtown. The next excuse I heard was that his civilian counterpart, the Korean, was on vacation. He didn't have any help in his surgery, so then I had to go and talk to the general and say, General, he has no help, can I help him? He said, sure, go ahead and give him a hand. So we said, look, we'll go down, we'll get the field surgical kit, which we had at the post. We went back, had a quick bite to eat, got the surgical kit. The guy was out of his hypotensive episode, awake, and we got back there with my interpreter, and lo and behold, guess what? All the transfusions, we had 3. We had a femoral artery catheterized and 2 brachial arteries catheterized, all shut off, patient dead. So I said to my houseboy, what went on? What's going on? I mean, this guy was pink and looking well. The houseboy spoke to the surgeon, in Korean, of course, turned to me and said, "You no have money, Captain." So they just clamped the blood, and that was that. You no have money to pay for medical care. So that's the story of the... Now, I had a number of interesting trips with the helicopter pilots. I loved to fly the H-13, which was the bubble, because you could fly about 400 or 500 feet above the ground. It was just a wonderful experience. And I always could find some pilot who needed some training time and that I could go with. So one day, I had a lieutenant that I knew, and he flew me up, and he said, I want you to go up and look at the 38th parallel. You can see what our encampment was like and everything else. So he took me up, and we're going down the middle of a river. I said, where are we? He said, well, we're right on the 38th parallel. Look over to your left there, Captain. I look over to the left, and I see the artillery pieces following everything that the helicopter is doing. I said, what's over there? He said, that's North Korea. I said, come on, Lieutenant, get me out of here. So what he was doing was flying down the middle of the river that separates North and South Korea, and we would have been duck soup for the artillery that was tracking us as we were going down the middle of the river. So that was enough for me. I never went up really to the DMZ. Here's the H-13, and pilots sat here, I sat here. This was a very excellent aircraft for evacuating wounded or anybody that was hurt. And it was first used, and that's exactly what I had in my an ambulance. That's what I had in my unit. Next slide. That's a better picture of the H-13, and that's the cockpit. Obviously, I didn't touch the pedals of his flying stick. That's the H-19. I didn't do anything with the H-19 except pick up a lot of bad accidents, so I never flew in it. In fact, I had a wonderful guy that I knew quite well, a major that was going home after completing 16 months, and they crashed. Everybody was killed. And I had the task of picking up the bodies and getting the quartermaster to take care of them. So I never flew in H-19. I was scared to death of it. There they were. Again, look at the hills that they talk about fighting over. It's a terrible terrain. Next slide. That's the H-21, and I flew in that. In fact, I took some wounded off a mountaintop with that. And the beauty of that is that I could communicate with the pilot and tell him where I wanted to go, Seoul to the main hospital, the MASH, or wherever. So it was a wonderful piece of equipment. Made a heck of a noise. I told you before what was north of us, the demilitarized zone, 1st Cav, 7th Infantry, a Royal Army of Korea, and Corps Artillery. This is what Uijeongbu, believe it or not, looked like just after the war. Completely flattened. And the next slide, I think, this is what it looks like today. Can you believe it? I mean, it is America's most successful story of a war and what happens post-war. This is what it looked like in 1954. I was there in 1957. Wasn't much different than that. Thatched roofs and terrible civilian quarters. South Korea in my day there was little infrastructure. It was mostly a rural country with lots of rice paddies. The bridges were incompletely repaired. There were no paved roads. The young men were mostly houseboys working for the military. The young women were prostitutes or GI steadies. The adult Koreans were farmers. There was no electricity in the villages, and they were heated by wood, and believe me, the winters were frigid. This is another, again, look at the mountains that they fought over. This is a thatched roof, the kind of housing that existed during my day. This is another look at some of the housing outside of the cities in Seoul. This is Seoul in my era. It's quite different today, I'm sure. Next slide. This is another look at the metal roofs and just destitute people post-war. Here's an upscale unit in Seoul of housing, much different from the preceding pictures. What were the dangers to the GIs in those days besides the insurgents? Theft of equipment, PX shipments. In fact, there was a guy that worked for the captain that ran our PX who walked off with a whole PX shipment hiring a boat in the south of Korea to take them to Japan. Malaria, tuberculosis, venereal disease, and parasitic disease. And road accidents. Signs were all around Korea, said drive carefully in Korea. The life you save may be your replacement. So we couldn't eat any of the food because of its nice soil fertilizer. Schistomiasis was rampant in the swimming pools or ponds, and there were, of course, as one knows now, myriads of North Korean infiltrators. For those of you who have never seen rice paddies, this is what a rice paddy looks like before it's planted. Some of these over here were planted again. Next slide. Here's what it looks like when early on, before it's harvestable. This is primitive irrigation. That's how they irrigated some of their rice paddies. And here is mature rice ready for harvest. Again, just to sharpen your eyes on some of the mountains that the Marines fought over during the Korean conflict. That's my quarters. This was permanent quarters, and our room, as you see, next slide, that's a young girl that we were fascinated with, and no kids around, but she was the daughter of somebody who worked in the General's Mess, which was background. So she was around the base near the General's Mess most of the time during the day. That's my houseboy. He'd been a houseboy for 6 physicians in a row. He could speak fairly good English. That's my bed that he just finished making. And the next slide, I think, that's my roommate, Dave Thomas, a neat guy. And unfortunately, I'd love to make contact with him, but there's no way of knowing how to get in touch with people that were in the military with you. Next slide. There was a thriving black market in U.S. goods in Korea in those days. And in fact, the rumor was that you could get anything you wanted for a price. And in fact, somebody told me, you could buy a tank if you want, Captain, not much money. The main bases were fairly sparsely populated with anything but alcohol and a movie theater, not very well classy cushioned seats, but such as they were. There was a post exchange. You could buy cigarettes, soap, and snacks, but not much else. The activities were gambling, and I remember the military police one night coming to me and telling me there were, because they had an injured MP, there was so much money on the table they didn't dare break up the game. So, I mean, you had nothing to spend on. There were military payment currency, and you had nothing really to spend your money on, so what could you do? I told you about alcohol abuse. It was rampant. The one saving factor was arrest and recuperation leave in Japan. Slot machines, alcohol, cheap meals. Houseboys were paid by the officers about $10 a month. The enlisted paid for houseboys at about $3 or $4 a month. Now, what was the Turkish brigade like? They were something else again. And I wanted to just go through what happened to them, but essentially what they found was that the Russians were, after putting up satellite places every now and again when they took over other countries, so the Turks didn't want any of that. So when the call came from the UN to provide help in Korea, the Turks sent a brigade to Korea. And in order for them to remain independent and to help the UN. Next slide. troops that came initially were all volunteers. Most of the brigade had never been away from Turkey, and most of the enlisted men had never been out of their little towns that they grew up in. So this was quite an experience for them. Next, that's a Turkish guard in front of the Turkish compound with a Turkish flag. There were characteristics of the Turkish troop. They never encountered non-Muslims. They ate no pork products. They preferred strong and heavily sweetened coffee. And they were amazing with what they called the long knife, and I have some pictures of that. They couldn't communicate very well. The enlisted men had almost no education, and they were superb combat fighters. Next. That's the Turkish brigade gate, and I'll tell you a story about that. One time somebody stole the Turkish flag, and the one-star general who commanded the Turkish brigade said that he would have the flag back or he'd hang one person a day until the flag reappeared. They hung one guy on the front gate, and the next day the flag reappeared. So that's Turkish, how the Turks behaved. They were amazing soldiers during the war. They were involved in many famous battles in Korea. They tried to, the North Koreans tried to brainwash them, but they never succeeded. They were ill-treated and half-starved when they came out, but they marched through the gate singing of the prison when they were released, singing songs. I had some experience with the Turks, and these were some Jeep drivers. We were invited to go hunting in the Turkish brigade. There were pheasant in Turkey, and we thought that'd be fun to do. So we got driven by these three enlisted men to where we were going to hunt pheasant. Interesting enough, when they got out of the Jeep, they came to attention, their weapon in front, and they stood in front of the Jeeps. They were going to protect those Jeeps from being stolen. Next slide. Some tales about their Turkish soldiers during the war. It was rumored that they had to be wounded 3 times before they ever went to a medic. And when they were surrounded by Chinese troops, short of ammunition and food, they fought with their long knives. They did anything to get. And when they were told to pull back, when they were surrounded, the Turkish commander said, "We're preparing to attack again. Withdraw? Why withdraw? We're killing lots of them." They were some kinds of soldiers. And there's the long knife, different from bayonets that we had, but that's the long knife. Now, we went pheasant hunting in this area. We walked over all kinds of small hills and everything else. And my roommate, Dave Thomas, bagged a pheasant right off. He was a real phenomenal shot, and he could hit anything from any place. But what I later learned is that they had dragged me through the most mined area in Korea. And that was enough for me. I never went hunting again with them. I did hunt some deer, but the military police gave me a long lecture about not killing South Korean cattle or otherwise. So I went out thinking, gee, with a carbine, semi-automatic weapon, my sergeant was going to come from the base of the hill and drive anything up to me. When I got to the top of the hill, I had 3 Korean kids. They always follow GIs because he had candy or something to give them. And after a while, up the hill came this strange looking animal. had horns, and I couldn't make up my mind. Did it belong to the Koreans? Was it something they had that I didn't recognize? Well, it turned out that I didn't get enough courage to shoot it. I probably could have thrown my weapon at him and hit him, but that's how close he came. But it turns out that the deer in Korea are not long-legged, they're short-legged. And that's what deceived me. This was a short-legged animal with antlers. I had no idea. The Korean kids looked at me as if I was some kind of a fool, which I probably was. But that's the... Now I had some other... I had a Jeep accident one time I got called to, and when I got there, the road was packed up this hill, so I turned on the siren when the sergeant was driving, and we got up there, and the roads in Korea on hills often were in a circular configuration. When I got up to the top of the hill, I looked out, there were two Turks standing at attention once I got out of the Jeep and saluting. Blood streaming down his face, and one guy with his arm up like this, and I thought to myself, geez, you know, what are they saluting me for? Well, it turns out that what they had done was, going around this semicircle, they had driven the Jeep right off and down into a rice paddy about 100 yards below, and hit his head, one of them, and the other had what appeared to be a broken arm. And what they were frightened of is that their officers would find out that they'd embarrassed the Turkish brigade and that they'd be in deep trouble. And that was all that worried them. But we got everybody taken care of and shipped off to where they should be, and I asked the sergeant to tell them, military police, to go easy on them, because I knew that it was said that if a Turk disobeyed an order, the sidearm would be drawn and he would be shot on the spot, and I believed it. And that's their, but I did know that they were difficult troops because when they went to Seoul, the one-star general led the whole brigade, and they were allowed to go into the Korean establishments and drink and buy food and everything else. So the Koreans never cared. It helped their economy, and they tolerated them. Next slide. The Rock Army was not very vigorous at the time I was there. It was poorly equipped because the Americans didn't want them to go up north and try and take North Korea, so they had no tanks, they had no aircraft. They were really slept with body warmth only, and so it was a miserable setting for anybody who was in the Royal Army of Korea. Next slide. I'm going to show you, I think, in a few slides. Next slide, maybe. It's a huge military force now. Let me go on. It now has 9 million men fit for duty, and it's the fourth or fifth largest military in the world. They're well trained, well equipped, and they've got an Army, Marine Corps, Navy, and Air Force, and they require everybody 2 years of service between the age of 20 or 30. So it's a different world. Sigmund Rhee is U.S. educated and imprisoned by the Japanese as a youth. He was intent on reuniting Korea. He was in charge when I was there. As I told you, the U.S. denied tanks and other armament because they were afraid the South Koreans would go north. they were only opposed by 65,000 South Koreans when the North Koreans crossed the border. Think of today with 9 million troops. Quite a difference. Incidentally, MacArthur only visited South Korea once during the whole Korean War, even though he commanded it. It was not a happy thought. And I would tell you another thing, the guy who he appointed, Armin, as the head to head up all the Korean forces, had never commanded anybody in combat before. And if it hadn't been for the Marine General O.P. Smith, the 1st Marine Division would have been decimated if they'd followed Armin's orders. Fortunately, O.P. Smith harangued him and quit. Am I running overtime? Next slide. I just show you some pictures of Sigmund Rhee and MacArthur. Next. There it is again. Bill, when would you like me to stop?
Probably a good time, David. David is speaking a second part of this presentation in June and talk about General Trapnell, who some of you may remember the name, who was on the Bataan Death March, and also about more of his involvement with North Korean POWs. It's interesting stuff. Does anybody remember the atomic cannon that David mentioned? I have a picture of it. It's a long, long, long thing on railroad tracks.
280 millimeters.
That's right. I don't know if they ever fired it there, but I guess one was there.
I have a picture of one. I don't know, maybe you could run through the rest of the pictures for them, if there are. That's the General's Mess. There's Sigmund Rhee going into the General's Mess. Another picture of Sigmund Rhee. That's Crapnell, by the way. That's Korean Marine Corps, 38th parallel. That's the river I was going down in the helicopter. That's North Koreans. That's it. But the next lecture has the picture.
Okay, and the Friends of the Council of Aging for each meeting graciously give us a $50 gift certificate. And we usually go to the restaurant called Lex downtown, but I went this time on something that occurred to me one night. This is a gift certificate for David and Cecil. Thank you, Cecil. For Wilson's. My wife would love to have one of these a week to go to Wilson's. $50 worth of stuff. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.